background of this book, Sea Change, is that my colleague Malcolm McIntosh and I have been talking for years about the problems of the world and what could be done about it. And we decided at some point that it was worthwhile writing a book. We've both been involved with the United Nations Global Compact for many years, and there were a lot of companies joining the Global Compact, and they were beginning to make some changes. And so the original idea for the book was that we would write something about the Global Compact, which was coming up then on its 10th anniversary, and had made huge progress. And so we thought, well, we could frame the book around the Global Compact. In the end, we chose not to do that. It really didn't work. But what we ended up doing was looking at the different types of enterprise that are emerging in the context of what we believe are some crises that businesses are facing. And so the book is called Sea Change, S-E-E capitals, because we believe that we need to see change. We also need sea change, in the sense of massive change. And we want to see companies and other institutions moving towards what we call SEE, S-E-E, the Sustainable Enterprise Economy. The premise behind the book is that, that there is a bubbling up of change that's coming in our economy. We see massive crises out there in the world, as I just mentioned, and among those crises are the climate change crisis and sustainability crisis. Biologists and ecologists believe that every single ecological system is in decline, if not at the edge of crisis. Climate change is, by some accounts, not just something that's going to happen in the future, but is actually already here. In 2008, we saw a massive meltdown of our economic and financial systems, and the world, it's now 2011, and the world still has not recovered from those changes, and significant fundamental changes haven't taken place. So it seemed to us that it was fairly unlikely that massive change, systemic change of the sort that we believe is needed, would come from existing institutions because they're too vested in the present. So the question we wanted to ask was, how in fact does change come about, the kind of change that we need? And the idea behind Sea Change is that there is in fact a way for change to happen. Joseph Schumpeter, the famous economist, talked about this as creative destruction. And when we looked around the world, we saw through the Global Compact, through the lens of the Global Compact, through the lens of small social entrepreneurial businesses, through the lens of big businesses that are implementing corporate responsibility programs and multi-sector partnerships, and through many other lenses, we saw that change is in fact beginning to bubble up. And so we call that type of bubbling up change Sea Change, because the kind of massive fundamental change that we think is necessary is not likely to happen at the macro level. So you know, in recent years we've seen the emergence of companies like Facebook and Google, which have sort of taken over their disciplines. Well, it's likely that some of these more sustainably oriented enterprises can be the next Google, the next Facebook, and that was a hope in sort of providing a roadmap to some of these changes that we hope are taking place. The fact that transition is so hard and that changes needed are so fundamental means that we need people with different kinds of skills, and companies and other institutions with different kinds of skills than we have today. So we really need people who can be systems thinkers and who really see and understand where the leverage points for change are. Those leverage points can be in starting, as I mentioned earlier, small enterprises that have a sustainability orientation at their core. So, for instance, what we're seeing in one sector of the economy now is companies that are called for benefit or B corporations. And these are companies that are actually founded not with a maximized shareholder wealth orientation, but in fact with an orientation towards what is called the triple bottom line. And that triple bottom line is social, it's economic, and it's also ecological or sustainability oriented. And so these companies are actually founded with that as a basis or as a premise, and that's how they live their lives. We're also seeing the emergence of something called the fourth sector, and the fourth sector is exactly this kind of multi-goal-oriented company, or sometimes it consists of enterprises that actually are what we would consider to be NGOs or nonprofit organizations that start in the social sector and bridge their way into for-profit types of enterprise, but with always sustaining that either that social or ecological purpose that they were begun with. And so you actually have a whole variety of types of boundaries that we used to in society just beginning to absolutely collapse. The boundaries that used to exist between the public sector and the private sector, or between the civil society and the business sector, are permeable now. You have enterprises that have multiple types of purposes coming from both sides. You have public sector boundaries being bridged by what are called global action networks. I have a colleague named Steve Waddell who has done a lot of work on these global action networks, or GANs. And GANs are really multi-stakeholder initiatives to try to effect change in some sort of public policy arena, because governments tend to be bounded by national boundaries, and many of the problems we're facing today are actually global problems. So all of the problems of sustainability and even the financial crisis are global in scope, and no one country, no one nation actually has sufficient geographic span. So how do you deal with these kinds of problems? So one of the things that started to happen is that companies, NGOs, sometimes government actors, and others come together in forums that Steve calls global action networks, and we could look at the Global Compact as being an example of these global action networks, where they can try to deal with some of these problems. So one example is the Global Compact. Another would be the Global Reporting Initiative, which asks companies and other types of enterprises to report not just on their economic bottom line, but also in systematic ways on their their social and sustainability bottom lines in a whole variety of criteria. Another would be the Marine Stewardship Council, which is an industry-oriented enterprise that is trying to take care that our oceans are not overfished. You have similar things happening with forests and many other arenas. So these enterprises, these new types of enterprises, are not businesses strictly. They're not nonprofit organizations strictly. They're not government organizations strictly. They're dealing sometimes with public good or common good types of problems, but their boundaries are very permeable, and they're sitting around tables talking to each other about the scope and the scope of the problems that we're facing, and how, in fact, we can devise mechanisms to deal with some of those problems. And so it's this kind of emergence, these for-benefit corporations, these big businesses that are engaging in public-private partnerships, these GANs and other types of similar enterprises that we believe represent this shift to a sustainable enterprise economy. You know, it's interesting because some people read the book and say that we seem like we're optimistic, and both my co-author Malcolm McIntosh and I are pretty pessimistic about the actual potential for change. But we believe that there has to be this type of change, and we are hopeful that it can come in the way that we've begun to describe and begun to see. What it means is when we think about what makes systems healthy, and this is thinking that I've done a little bit past the book, but when we think about what makes systems healthy, it's really the diversity of different types of things that are in the system. So if you're talking about an ecological system, what makes for a healthy ecology is many different types of plants and animals and other types of little organisms and all types of species, so that if something happens to one of them, the whole system doesn't collapse. What we saw in the crisis of 2008 should give us pause around sort of the structure of our current system. We have huge institutions in our current system, many of which were considered at that time too big to fail. Corporations that were too big to fail, financial systems that were too big to fail, governments, of course, that we always consider to be too big to fail. What that means is we haven't got enough diversity in our systems, because all of these institutions are too big to fail, and we have to go out and try to rescue them, when it's clear that the structural elements of those big institutions make them rigid, unable to adapt to the climate change and the sustainability crises and the financial crisis and the jobs crisis. And we could go on. There's any number of crises we could talk about that are faced in our industry. And so the bubbling up of many smaller institutions gives us some hope that eventually some of these very large, quote unquote, too big to fail institutions will in fact be someday replaced by the smaller, diverse array of institutions that provide a healthy way for economies to thrive, a healthy way for we humans to interact with our natural environment, and a healthy way for us to interact with each other as communities. And because we're all owning pieces of that, and it doesn't just belong to the sort of privileged few, but we're all part of it. We're all contributing to it. We're all benefiting from it. Not equally, of course, but in some degree in a fair and equitable way. Part of the influence for this book was, of course, the UN Global Compact, as I mentioned earlier. And that I was very much influenced by some of the people who founded both the Global Compact and the Global Reporting Initiative, and other people I profiled in an earlier book called The Difference Makers. And these people are brilliant, forward-looking people who really understand the systemic nature of the crises that we're facing and have taken actions through their work to try to effect change in the system by building these enterprises that I talked about, the Global Compact, some social research firms. There are people all over the world doing these kinds of activities that we tend not to recognize, and part of this work is to recognize the significant change that can take place from smaller enterprises growing and making a difference in the world, providing an example for others to follow of individuals who are doing that and really beginning to make a difference in the world, and not just throwing up your hands in despair because the world has a lot of problems. Because basically, I believe that we all need to act in whatever our gift is. We need to use that gift to push an agenda of change and responsibility and sustainability forward. And then I guess basically that would be my fundamental message that I hope came across in the book, and that my colleague Malcolm also I think believes, that we need to be actors for the common good.